decision.
Aspects of church life here lately, and trying to get people to understand that it's okay to be unhappy with the way things are, but at some point you have to accept the way things are and make the most of it. It's just life.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how many people get stuck because they don't move on from bad luck or bad circumstances, bad decisions, I guess you may end up making more bad decisions or slogging your way through something really complicated in order to get to a better place. But if you do nothing, then you're just stuck. And that's not very good.
No.
And it's amazing how many people I encounter in my life and ministry especially that are just stuck. Anyway.
Yeah.
Got a plan?
It requires courage, I think, to get unstuck. And not a lot of people have that.
Yeah. Katrina and I were just talking about that this morning, that it is an unusual characteristic, it turns out, to have really unrelenting courage. And courage is not necessarily the same thing as bravery. Courage is not necessarily the same thing as fearlessness, because courage is the determination to plunge forward towards something that you're afraid of. But you're not going to let your fear stop you. You're going to make calculated decisions. You're going to take calculated risks, but you're going to press on.
Yeah.
And that takes a special kind of person. It turns out they don't grow on trees.
Right.
I think some are born with that, but it has to be developed. I don't think anybody gets, just automatic character and courage, because courage is always about decisions.
I think that starts from a young age.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you have one person who believes in you and thinks that you can do it, you're strong, and pours in those truths to you from a young age, you're going to be much more likely as an adult to have that unrelenting courage.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I think we've already started the podcast without trying.
Maybe we'll just leave all this in and...
I think so.
All right.
Well, hello, officially. Welcome to the Echo Podcast, where we discuss how our hearts and minds can be an echo of God's heart and mind and what that even means in this world. We're Pastor Dan Sinkhorn and Adrienne Tarullo from Shiloh Church of Jasper, Indiana, and I think we've already started today's podcast. Mm-hmm. So Pastor D and I were just talking about some courage and just some interesting things there, and I think he made some excellent points that leads right into today's podcast of what we wanted to talk about, which I am so excited about, let me just say, because we're talking about the next generation. We're talking about the youth, and that's my jam.
Yeah.
Pastor Dan.
That's kind of how you came to be a part of our team.
Yeah. So I'm just so excited. We're going to do 2 parts to this podcast, not only because I'm emphatic about this subject, but because we just think it makes sense.
Yeah.
Because this past week at Shiloh, we recognized our seniors in high school, not to be confused with senior citizens. And we had a nice crew up there, and we recognized their just sheer awesomeness. We have an incredible group this year.
Yeah.
I think they're always incredible, but this year just stands out to me. I mean, it's wild. I won't call them out individually, but they have such strong hearts and minds, and they courageously step out for Jesus every day. In a generation that is just saturating them with false truths, i.e. lies, right? There's so many fundamental beliefs out there that these kids have that are just off. Like, it's just not right. But I can say through knowing these kids that they're in a good place spiritually. And I think even the word spiritual has a lot of connotations these days. Teenagers are actually very spiritually open right now, says research, right? Teenagers have this spiritual openness. But when I'm talking about our kids' spirituality, I'm talking about God, the one and only God, the Father Almighty, right? I think, well, I know for sure through the research that I've done and the conference that I've attended and stuff, the fastest growing religion or faith ideology belief in this next generation is called syncretism. I think I said that right. And basically what that is, it's just they take bits and pieces from different religious beliefs and ideologies and they make their own, which we can imagine is such a slippery slope. Holy cow. Like, oh, I like this certain thing from Buddhism and I like this certain thing from Christianity, but what I don't like about Christianity is the hard stuff. So I'm not going to do that. But what I am going to, and it's just, that is not the one true God. And so if there is no ultimate truth and ultimate being, what does that mean for our lives? I don't know. I'm not used to doing this much talking. I'm going to pass the buck to you.
No, it's okay. I'm just processing everything you're saying. I feel like people will hear you and resonate with what you're saying, you know, and that there's a sense that people are afraid, you know, of what that means. But I think a more encouraging message that underlies that is that they're truth seekers. You know, and we have an opportunity to point them to the truth. But we have to do it with a tremendous sensitivity. You can't assume that some sort of corrective, condescending statement is going to get it done, because it won't.
Amen.
It never really does. But, you know, there was a time, and have been many times in the church era of the last 2,000 years, where young people with radical ideas were just told, well, that's just not true, and that's not how it is, and this is what we believe, period. Don't talk about that again. You know, well, that doesn't get you anywhere. But this Sunday, I'm going to be talking about this coming Sunday, I'm going to be talking about the importance of encouraging young people. And I'm going to try to encourage them myself to recognize that all the great revivals and most of the really profound movements in Christianity over the last 2,000 years have been young people. It's hard to wrap our minds around it because we've sort of grown up with the disciples and the apostles, the 12 apostles in particular, in our minds. Well, I wish I hadn't said that. I'd rather just kind of back up and try that again. I grew up knowing who the 12 apostles were. And so that means when I was a little kid, I looked up to them and they seemed like old men. But the truth is, Jesus was 30. Jesus was 30, and he recruited people who were probably around 20. He changed the world with 13 people, counting himself. Of course, you know, he's God incarnate, so I mean, he could count exponentially as more than one person. But the fact is 13 people all under the age of 30 changed the world forever. And then Paul comes along, and he's really not that much older than them by the time he gets involved. And you can talk about the shorter lifespans and all of that, but the fact is that in the Bible it's clear that historically people do live to be 70, 80, sometimes 90 years old pretty consistently, even in those Old Testament times. It's just that a lot of ordinary people with ordinary lives and jobs didn't get much past 50 or 60. But that was more circumstantial than anything. So I would resist anybody trying to argue that they were older in some way than the years would make them seem now. Nah. These were young people. And some of the greatest movements in church history have been sparked by similar people, these young people, because young people, and I mean, we're seeing it, like, oh boy, I don't want to go there. Like, we're seeing protests on campuses right now. But the truth is that idea of cultivating the minds of young people and getting them to change the world is, in a way, diabolically misused on a lot of college campuses, in my opinion. Diabolically misused. There are people who are my age who know what they're doing and why they're doing it, and they have an agenda. And their agenda is to tinker in the minds of these young people, knowing that young people are reckless and flamboyant, and they're willing to try to turn the world upside down because it's just their nature. There's a reason that we send young people to war. They're courageous to a fault. They're highly driven by their idealism, and their youth and vigor makes them think they're indestructible, and so they'll do things that older people know better than to do or have grown weary of doing. So there's a reason that protests and things happen on college campuses, because it's understood by the systems at these college campuses that you can influence these young minds and you can get them to do the things that you wish would happen. And I say it's diabolical because what I see happening throughout my adult life on college campuses, for the most part, has been very countercultural and counterproductive for the most part. And so I don't want to weigh in on the recent campus protests and the particular topic, because that's an entirely different discussion. But what I do want to say is that everybody in leadership, anyone who has intellectual energy that they're trying to exploit in one way or another, recognizes the power of youth, the potential of youth. And what's really funny, in my experience, is that in the local churches, that's probably one of the few places where we don't encourage the youth. And by this, I'm really not talking about like your typical church youth group of 16 and 17-year-olds. I'm talking about young people in general. People your age and down to teen years, right? Like, we have a tendency in church to be resistant to people who seem to be upsetting the status quo. And the church is dying of it, and has been for quite some time. And ironically, the people who are now old enough to be the ones resisting are also the same ones that were part of the 60s resistance movements. No, they weren't all hippies, and they weren't all Jesus freaks, and they weren't all of that, but they were people who were part of a generation that felt that their adult leadership was radically flawed in certain ways and needed to be revolutionized in some way or another. And so they did. And now I'm a pastor in 2024 in my 60s, looking at my church and seeing how that generation was very comfortable with the changes that they brought about. And they're not real keen on having somebody come along and mess with them. This generation from the 1960s had a phrase that many of them used: don't trust anyone over 30. And now these people are 50 years over 30. You know?
Yeah.
And again, I'm not generalizing, and I don't mean to generalize, and I don't want anybody in this older age bracket to be offended by what I'm saying. Because what I really mean to say is let's just look at the way things are, and let's recognize that what you just said is that the young people have this syncretistic sort of religion where they're just pulling together the various aspects of world religions that they kind of know about and coming up with their own sort of belief system. And the reason they're doing that is because no one's influencing them intentionally on those matters. And then when they get to the college campuses, not all of them, it would be a fool who sits here with a microphone and says that everything is one way or another.
Right.
The world is vast, and there are all kinds of examples of good college leadership and good professors and good teachers, good college administrators doing amazing work. I know they're out there. The ones that get all the attention, though, seem to have a very diabolical agenda. And the last thing they want to do is teach Christian morality to 20-year-olds who are taking their classes. And so that's why the battleground for the souls of young people has been largely college campuses.
Yeah.
You know.
And unfortunately, you're right, because the statistics say that 50% of teenagers, 50% lose their faith when they go to college.
Yep.
We're losing half of them. It's truly a battleground.
And like it or not, it's mostly coming from the senior, well, I say senior, there should be a better term in that. It comes from people who are between 40 and 70 years old who are teaching and administering the schools. Now, granted, there are other students who are, already radically disposed to these ideas, so they've already been radicalized, and so you have this conspiracy, so to speak, of tenured professors with radical ideas that never, get challenged because, your grades depend on this person's approval, and so you get into these college campuses where people have all the control they need over what these people are going to articulate. I mean, when I was going to college and when I was going to seminary, I had developed a method that was pretty hard for even the most radical professors to argue with. And I wasn't alone in this. I learned it from other students, but I would very clearly articulate what they wanted me to hear them saying. I would say it in discussions, or I would write it in my papers. Professor so-and-so, I understand that you are trying to make the case for X, Y, Z, and this is why. And I understand that you're really committed to this because of your observations and your research and the writings of certain people. And I clearly understand your message, but I disagree. And I choose not to accept that message. And here's why. And here's what I do believe. And when I got that down, when I kind of figured out how to do that, and I kind of made up my own formula and started following it consistently, I got A's. because these people are not, they're intellectuals. And so from an intellectual standpoint, they have a dilemma. They can either say, well, I'm going to fail you just because you should agree with me. Or they have to say, I can't fail you. You've articulated a clear understanding of my message, and you don't accept it. And so they have either the moral choice of being so committed to their agenda that they're going to fail you because you reject it. But they might have to defend themselves for doing that, and they're well aware of it. And it turns out they're being graded too, because their own institution and their tenuring agencies and their various associations are going to call them out when a student who writes a paper like that presents them with an argument like that, and it's clear that the professor wasn't fair, you know. So what I try to tell young people is do your critical thinking, learn a formula that works for you to articulate that you have heard what they say, you have read the book they told you to read, and you have given it your critical thought, and you still don't agree. Because that is what higher education is supposed to be about. Well, that would make me think that one of the intelligent things that you have to do in the Christian world is intelligently articulate the values and the beliefs and the things, the doctrines and so forth that we espouse. And to say to a young person is like, I'll tell you right now, this is why the title of the message for Sunday is called Worthy of Respect. Mm-hmm. And I chose that because I'm not very good at making titles for sermons. About 3 or 5 times a year, I get really clever and come up with something pithy. Most of the time, it's just, you know, like the old pamphlets that John Wesley or somebody, you know, on sanctification. Yeah. That's my typical sermon title, you know. So this one's Worthy of Respect. And it's because I'll tell you what, the number one thing that all adults intuitively know, but they all regularly get wrong. So we know instinctively this important truth, but we regularly get it wrong. And that is that everyone younger than you and smaller than you is worthy of respect. You know, when I'm talking to the 3 to 5 year olds down the hall in our preschool, I get down on their level and I talk to them eye to eye, and I talk to them as though I'm talking to a smaller, less knowledgeable adult.
Yeah.
You know, I don't assume that they're stupid, and I don't, you know, and that they don't have the capacity to grasp larger concepts. They just don't have the vocabulary. And they may lack a certain amount of worldliness, but they're not unintelligent. Heck, when we were having babies and my wife was pregnant, I was talking around that baby in the womb as though it was in the room.
Really?
Well, because I just assumed that this kid was in there cooking and hearing everything that was going on.
Sure.
And, you know, so my premise, my fundamental premise is everybody's worthy of some respect. Now, for what it's worth, there are people who will take away that respect. They get respect from me from the get-go, but they squander it. They throw it away by doing and saying foolish things. And then one day I just think, well, there's no longer any need for me to try to have meaningful conversation with this person. Now, you might think that's a weakness in my part, but I just figure I've got a finite lifespan and I've got a finite amount of spiritual and intellectual energy. And when people just drain it, and I'm kind of an introvert. People who don't believe pastors can be introverts don't know enough pastors. Plenty of us are introverts. And so we really guard the amount of interactive energy that we have, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm like these electric cars. When I'm interacting with people, I'm running the meter down, and at some point I have to go plug in again and recharge, you know? So I don't mean to get off on that, except to say that when I talk to people, I feel like I'm making an investment in the relationship with them. And because it costs me something to spend that energy. And I think everybody's worth it until they're not. So bringing it back full circle, I think that one of the most diabolical thing that happens on college campuses especially is that the professors and the influencers are really people that don't have much respect for young people, because they're assuming that this is just some knucklehead whose mind is a bunch of mush that they're going to tinker with. And so my advice to young people is disagree, argue, but argue intelligently. Give critical thought to what you're observing and hearing, and then ask the reasonable question. Yeah, I keep hearing you say this, but what about that? Well, your response doesn't make any sense to me. Try again. Oh, by the way, I'm paying for this.
Right.
I have said that to my professors and to my doctors and my dentists and dare say even physical therapists, for all I know. I've said to them, I'm paying for this. I could pay someone else for this, but I'm paying you for this. No, you're not. Your insurance is paying for it. Government loans pay. It doesn't matter. I could take my government loan and go to some other college.
Yeah.
I could take my scholarship and go somewhere else. And young people, I don't know how to say this because I'm not trying to radicalize you in my own particular way. But what I want to say to you is that you, in the adult world, you become a consumer. You become a patron. You become, as an adult, someone who has money and energy to spend. And you need to spend it wisely. Everything in you from high school says, and we parents will do this without realizing it, but let's just take our graduates, for example, that we just acknowledged. They spent the last 2 years trying to build their portfolio up so that they could be good candidates for good universities and schools. When I graduated from high school, my school counselor told me that I was good for the military, right? Because I hadn't built up a portfolio that made me a good candidate for anything other than the military or Claremore Junior College. So I went to Claremore Junior College. It's Claremore University now in Claremore, Oklahoma, because everybody's a university now. But it was a junior college. It was your chance to do high school over again and do it better this time. And pay for the privilege, which is amazingly motivating. Because now you're paying for it. And by the way, I think it was like $38 a credit hour.
Holy cow. That's almost nauseating compared to what we're paying now.
Accounting for the fact that it was, a junior college in Oklahoma in 1981, but still, yeah, 38.
Let me just give you a little perspective. I just attended pretty much a community college. It was a 2-year degree. I paid $8,000 a semester to attend.
Yeah.
That's crazy. Granted, it was out of state, but still.
Now, I've worked, for $3.75 an hour at a pizza joint to get my $38, and most classes were 2 credit hours. So, just to put it in perspective. Now,
Sure.
my parents helped me out, but I don't want to go off on a tangent there, but just to put it in perspective, these kids have won scholarships, and they've their parents have saved, and they're going to take out student loans, and these kids are going to get really good education, really good schools, but they're also going to pay all of that money to people who will disrespect them and try to damage their young minds. Now, that's a pretty harsh thing for me to say, because it may not happen at all the schools these folks are going to. It probably won't happen in every class they take. Fact is, when I was going to college, and see, I went to college for 20 years. I went to Claremore Junior College, and then I went into the world of work, and I didn't finish getting my undergrad degree until I was 30 something, 35, 37, something like that. Close to 40 maybe. And so I was an adult taking classes at different times, and then seminary classes. And I kind of did two versions of seminary, so I've got like a double seminary education. And as an adult, I would interact with these teachers. Sometimes they were younger than me even, as an adult. And they had a little bit, they prefer young people because young people won't argue with them.
Yeah.
So this is my point. These young people that we just start celebrating right now and sending off to college next semester, they're going into an environment that they worked hard to be accepted for. So in their mind, this is a privilege to be there. In their minds, they competed to be accepted.
Sure.
In their minds, they're going into an environment where all their lives they've been trying to, at the very least, stay out of trouble with the teachers and administrators of the schools. At the very best, they were trying to win the approval and the accolades or whatever of the teachers. So their whole grade school, high school mindset is going into a college environment where a lot of the institutional mindset is completely different. They're banking on these kids coming in naive and afraid. I used to, at one point in my ministry life, early in my career back in the 90s, I was taking college classes at Indiana University Southeast down in New Albany.
Yeah.
While I was serving at church and substitute teaching at the Lanesville schools. And as a substitute teacher, I would really enjoy when I had seniors in the high school because they were so mature and fun to talk to. But then the next day I'd go down to the college and I'd take a freshman class, and here are the same young people 6 months later or a year later, and they're acting like complete knuckleheads because they just went from the top of the food chain to the bottom again. And all of a sudden they're like little fish in a bigger pond and they're scared.
Yeah.
And so what I want to say to the young people is you got to, as rapidly as you can, especially you high school graduates, you've got to rapidly grasp that the adults that are in charge of your life and in charge of things like maybe you're going to go into the military, maybe you're going to go into the workforce, and God bless you if you do, because there are plenty of really important professions that need to be filled. Hands-on, hard work professions that require tremendous skill. And what you have to do as a young adult is figure out how to balance your need for learning and your self-respect. And what happens in college in particular, but I also felt it when I was in the working, I was in the trucking industry in my 20s because I didn't want to finish college because I still didn't know what I wanted to be when I grow up. So I'm working in the trucking industry, sweeping floors in truck dealerships and using steam jennies to clean grease off of old truck parts, and I'm doing really hard work, and the people were pretty hard to work with because everybody starts the same way, and that means being treated like trash until you earn some respect. So the trick that I wish I could somehow impart to young people would be, you have to go into adult life humble, but you can't sacrifice your self-respect. Now, there's a huge difference between self-respect and self-esteem, right? Self-esteem is not necessarily a good thing. In fact, I don't see where it's good at all, Self-esteem will certainly hinder your relationship with God, because self-esteem is essentially the essence of sin. You're esteeming yourself higher than you ought to. You're putting yourself on a higher plane. You're thinking that you are more important than you really are. You're expecting people to take you as seriously as you take yourself. This is a bad thing. But self-respect says, if I heard you talking to my good friend Pastor Dan that way, I'd punch you in the nose. So why are you talking to me in the mirror that way, right? Mm-hmm. Self-respect says that you're as entitled to dignity and self-respect as anybody else, and that your personhood is worthy of respect. Like I said, worth respect. These are people that deserve to be respected. And we can respect people without even having a solid, like, reason. How do I say this? Obviously, you can respect a person because they're well credentialed. You can respect a person because they're clearly skilled at a particular thing. I know lots of young people, like early teens, that grow up on farms and in rural environments who have an amazing skill set. I mean, they can operate machinery and they can manage animals and they can manage circumstances that most people would be terrified to do, or at the very least they might go in boldly and kill themselves or lose a limb because they are so stupid, or so ignorant would be a better way to put it, right? And yet I'll see some 14-year-old operating a backhoe or a piece of heavy equipment skillfully, and I respect that.
Yeah,
I respect that. And I guess that's what I'm trying to say is everybody's got a reason to respect them. When I was 14 years old, I didn't know very much, but something I knew a lot about? I knew a lot about trains and railroading because that was my passion as a little kid. I loved trains and I loved railroading. And by the time I was 14 years old, I knew a lot about railroading and stuff like that. I don't know anybody that respected me for it. Mm-hmm. But if I'd known then what I know now, I could have respected myself for it. I knew my way around the woods. I lived in the woods of Western Pennsylvania. I grew up in a house that was adjacent to a vast, well, I wouldn't say forest, but a huge acres and acres and acres of woodland in the rolling hills of Western Pennsylvania. And I spent hours and hours walking around in the woods, walking around creek beds and turning over rocks to see what was under them and looking at different plants and flora and fauna and all of that. And it turns out you do that long enough, you have a knowledge and an instinctual presence in the woods that is undeniable. And I still have it. So I'm not trying to make this about me. It's just the only way I know how to articulate my point is to relate it to my own experience. Well, if I know that 14-year-old, I got a reason to respect that kid. And see, it turns out that everybody's got intrinsic value. It turns out that everybody knows things or has particular gifts and graces that make them unique, and they should be valued for their uniqueness. And the only way that's going to happen is if we discover it, if we take the time to get to know people. And so older people in the church, they resist sometimes the leadership and the influence of younger people, and it has almost always more to do with their fear than their actual understanding of what's going on. And if they understand, it's because they asked. It's because they talked to the people involved. They had a relationship with someone that garnered respect. I mean, to put it another way, I am very hopeful about the future of the church as long as we can hold it together till the young people rise to the occasion. And it doesn't mean I got something against that's part 2, by the way. You guys have tuned in for part 2. Part 2, we're going to talk about older members and so forth. But But the fact is that when I was going to college, when I was going to seminary as an adult, I was meeting the young people who are now raising their own kids, and I'm thinking they could do this. They've got it. The people we have right now who are governing us are people that we just don't get too excited about and we're not real confident in. But their generation's about to pass on. And, in the same way that we don't have World War II veterans in Washington anymore, or if we do, they're very few, far between, because they've aged out and we just don't have them anymore. In that same way, we're also losing a generation of governing people who are dying off, and they're taking with them some of the things that we despise, and I don't know where I was going with that exactly, except to say that I'm very confident that the church has potential like that, because there are a lot of things I don't like about the way most local churches operate. I don't share the vision that a lot of the pastors I know seem to have about local churches and what they should look like. There seem to be two general visions for local churches, and one of them is the wannabe mega churches, I call them, where churches don't look like churches. They look like auditoriums with stages and fancy lighting and smoke machines. And their pastors, whether they're too old to pull it off or not, are wearing untucked plaid shirts and spiky hair and trying to be cool. And that seems to be one model for church. And then you have this other model, which is a sort of staunch commitment to never changing, right? And it's like, well, what if you just said, we're a body of people who were floating adrift on an open sea and we landed here. And this is what we've got and this is how we're going to make it. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm so tired of people saying we're not successful at church. We're not doing religion right unless we do it a certain way that we see other apparently successful people doing it. And what I really, really, really want to do, and you're part of this, Adrienne, that's why we're having this podcast, is I really just want to listen to you and people like you and your kids that you're working with. I just want to listen to you. And I want to hear you say what church feels like it should be. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm here with a specific set of skills, credentials, knowledge, and authority. But hopefully it's authority that's built on respect, because I've won that authority. So I've earned the authority to say, all right, we can do that, but don't go over here because that's off bounds. That's out of bounds. Don't go over here. That's thin ice. You're going to get hurt if you go over there. It's my job as the wise person with the knowledge and the experience and the authority to say, I want you to be the church. I want you to be the body of Christ. And I'm just here to protect you from going into places that you shouldn't go and to guard the boundaries, because I'm very clear on those. And if you want to test those boundaries, well, let's do that together. Let me take you over to the edge of the boundary and let's both get our binoculars out and let me show you some of the hazards that I'm trying to help you avoid, instead of being arbitrary and autocratic and just saying, no. So I'm very open-minded. If you come in here and you convince me that church needs to be like, an auditorium, smoke machines and lights and, cool pastors, if that really is the right way, okay. But I don't believe there's one right way. I don't believe that there's a success formula that we should all follow, and that's why I really resent it when I'm watching videos or looking at downloads or something, or watching on, Right Now Media or something, and it's always the church with the fancy lighting and the spiky haired dude telling me how to do church right. I have a real resentment about that.
Yeah.
Because it's like, well, I'd rather talk to the young people who are going to be the church for the next 40 or 50 years and ask them what the right way to do church is. And then I'm hoping that they will respect me enough to let me help them guard the sacred things. To say, okay, there's certain things that are sacred. And, it turns out that you can't mix a little of this and a little of that because they don't mix. So,
yeah.
I don't know. What do you think about all that?
Yeah, I think you've covered a lot of ground, and I have several thoughts. My first thought was when you were talking a lot about respect. I think respect is huge, and something that I was thinking when you were talking about that, you said, all I know is like my own experience, so I'm just speaking from my own experience. And I thought, well, I think that's the underlying tone of what respect is. If you think about it, I think where there's a big breakdown between the younger generation and the older generation, I'll say maybe your age and up, right? We could say that. Mm-hmm. So like 60s and up. I think where that breakdown lies is in the belief from the older generation that the younger generation is lazy and worthless, and they don't know what it's like to work hard, because when I was their age, I was working the farm and I was walking uphill both ways in the snow. And there's just all of these based on their own experience, right? So I don't want to discredit them. They probably did have a physically harder upbringing.
I would like to point out to you that when I was young, and I was your age or younger, there were older people my age
saying how much
the same thing.
Worse they had it.
It seems like every older generation is convinced that every younger generation is lazier and less productive.
Yeah.
But anyway, keep going.
But yeah, and it's based on their own perspective, right? The generation before them had to deal with war and all of the casualties and horrible things of that. So I think there are probably harder things in the older generations, and I don't want to discredit that. However, we can't discredit the problems and the challenges that these young kids are facing. This is the first generation who's native to technology and to social media. That's all they've ever known. The iPad kids, right?
Yeah.
They're 1.5 years old, they're crying, and the mom shoves an iPad in their face. That's how these kids grew up. And so I don't think we can even talk about the youth without talking about social media and the impact of it and technology. Because something I was thinking about driving over here today is that technology makes us look down and it distracts us from looking up at God.
Yeah.
Right? And so, but also social media is impacting these kids on a whole new level. When we were growing up and say you got bullied in school, yeah, the school knew about it. Yeah, your friend group knew about it. Yeah, it was embarrassing. Yeah, it was hard, right? You get shoved in a locker and you're like, oh man, everybody sees me. This is terrible. Kids get bullied now, the whole world knows about it. It's all over for everyone to see. And so they quite literally feel like everyone is against them. And it's a really isolating experience, I could imagine. Thankfully, I've never encountered that myself, been attacked online. But that is a huge thing that these kids have to overcome. And their prefrontal cortex is not developed. They don't know how to handle that. Right? So they're faced with these immense challenges that the older generation can't even think about relating to. They literally have no idea because they didn't experience it. And so I think that it's so important. You said everyone has intrinsic value. And that's so important. Everyone has intrinsic value. No matter where you've come from, no matter what the choices you've made, no matter what you've done, you have value. Mm-hmm. And that's a message that we get from God. God cares about every hair on our head. He cares about every single thing that we do. We have intrinsic value because of who we are, not because of what we do. Right? Now, granted, the things that we do are important, and we want to model our lives after Christ, but I think that this whole respect breakdown, kids are so sensitive to it. Mm-hmm. They immediately know when someone older than them doesn't respect them, and they want nothing to do with it. Because they can have nothing to do with it. They can say, well, whatever, I have a lot more friends, I have social media, I have whatever, I don't want to be around you. And so perhaps that's where the church needs to step in and not say really isolating authoritative things like, well, this is just how we do things because this is how we do things. Right. And I think that you, Pastor Dan, are modeling a great example of what it looks like for an older person to be like shepherding basically a younger person and say, hey, look, I've seen the world, I have experience, and I want to show it to you, but not in a super demanding, this is how you must do things kind of way. That's oppression. Yeah. That's oppression. And this younger generation, myself included, isn't going to go for that. We're like, right. no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be oppressed. Right? And rightfully so. And so you're saying, okay, here's what I've seen. Let me show you this perspective so that you can make your decision. And there's a respect there where you say, okay, I then trust your decision as long as you stay in these boundaries that I've learned. Yeah. Right? Because I can't possibly have had the experience that you've had. So we can work together and accomplish something so much bigger than ourselves. Mm-hmm. So I think respect is a huge, huge deal. And I'll say older people are not shy. You know, they lose that filter in a certain point in time where they are not shy about letting these young kids know that they do not respect them.
Yeah, and it's, you know, the shame is that I hear older people saying the same things. Well, these young people just don't respect us.
Right.
They don't appreciate what we know, and they don't, you know, they think that because our bodies are older that we are, you know, slow in our minds and our bodies, and that, you know, we don't have anything to contribute. And, you know, the whole world is sending this message that unless you're young and beautiful, you're not of any worth. And, you know, it turns out that is a real problem. And so it comes back to the fact that worthy of respect is the name of the message, because it turns out everybody's worthy of respect. And the only reason you don't know that is because you haven't asked. Like, the most important thing we can do is recognize the intrinsic value of every human being. That it turns out that when, you know, we try to model this in church, but it always breaks down. But like when we have a children's sermon, the idea, when the right person does it, because some people are better at children's sermons than others.
Yeah.
Not going to lie. And I'm not thinking of anybody in particular. I'm just saying after 28 years of ministry, I've seen some really great ones and I've seen some really bad ones.
Yeah.
And it always depends on who you're talking to. Because if you're up there trying to talk to the adults and make them think you're an awesome children's leader, the kids aren't with you. You know, they don't care. Yeah. But if you just go up there and talk to them, and the kids just happen to have all these adults listening in, well, there's something really magical that happens. Because it turns out that 5, 6, 10-year-olds, they are pretty smart, and they're really fun to talk to if you just get down on their level and talk to them with respect. And you know what respect is? It's saying to a 9-year-old, I don't understand what that means. Teach me. For example.
Yeah.
You know, it might not come out like that. You might say, now you just used a word I've never used before. What does that mean? You know, or you're talking about something I've never used before. I've never played that game, you know. You're not telling them there's anything wrong with that. You're telling them you don't understand because you didn't connect with that. So you do the same thing with an older adult. You know, you go to an older adult and you say, hey, you know, I want to be your friend, and I want to hear about your life and learn about you. You know, I think, because we need to wrap up, I think that if I could put it in the simplest terms, people just want to be seen. You know?
Yeah.
They just want to be seen. And it isn't just enough to say, I hear you, I see you. You have to respond in a way that says, I'm even willing to adjust my world for that. But what I'm saying is going to sound like a contradiction to somebody who's going, yeah, but didn't your church just disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church over that terrible issue? Well, no, we disaffiliated, at least for my part, because there was a radical difference of opinion of who God is and how God rolls, and how God operates. Like people want to make it about the outcomes, but that's like treating symptoms instead of treating the actual core problem.
Bingo.
I disaffiliated because I disagree about things that affect the symptoms and the outcomes, not that I disagree about the symptoms. So I'm not going to argue with people about things that they want to argue about. I'm going to say, no, this is about my opinion of God. So if I say to you, I see you, I hear you, I accept you, but I still have this determination to honor God at all costs. And if that causes you a conflict in your mind or makes you confused or angry with me because it sounds like I'm saying I accept you, but I don't accept you, you need to reconcile the fact that I'm talking about two different relationships. I'm talking about my relationship with God, which is more important than my relationship with you. I don't mean that in a disrespectful or condescending way. It just is.
It just is.
And so my relationship with God supersedes my relationship with you to the extent that I will not compromise my relationship with God for the sake of our friendship. But in every other way, our friendship is still valid because our friendship is built around mutual respect. And it turns out there's much that we can mutually respect about one another, even if we don't agree about every little thing. And this is the chaos of the world that these young people are inheriting right now. Is if you aren't with me, you're against me. If you don't agree with me, I hate you. If you don't convert to my way of thinking, you shouldn't even be alive. You shouldn't even be allowed to exist. I mean, what kind of crazy chaos is that? Well, it turns out Satan is the guy that's behind chaos and oppression. And oppression says, you're not as valuable as I am. If you disagree with me, then your life isn't worth the same as mine. If you don't agree with me, you shouldn't be alive. I mean, we're living in a world where the chaotic, oppressive thinking of Satan is dominating the airwaves. And it turns out that the cure is love, respect, dignity. And dignity says, even when we disagree, you have a right and a value. You have a worth and a sacred presence that I don't. Like your life matters even if we don't agree about everything. And the fact is, we coexisted before we knew we disagreed. We can coexist even now that we disagree. It's okay. So I don't know how people are going to figure out how they do that if they don't agree with our commitment to certain doctrinal standards that are going to prevent them from having certain ceremonies here at this church. I don't know how they reconcile with that because I don't hate them. In fact, I would love to get to know them, and I bet you I would find 100 reasons to respect them. But I still wouldn't waver on my commitment to certain standards that are indicators of my reverence for God.
Yeah.
And can they respect me for being that reverent and willing to sacrifice in the name of that reverence? Can they say, well, I respect that. I'll just go somewhere else for that ceremony, but I still respect you. Can they do that? Can I do that? I think I can. I think I meet people all the time that I may not agree with their lifestyles, but I still like them. And I still like learning from them. And I still like buying what they sell, and and I still like doing business with them. Gosh, what an uncivil world these children are inheriting.
Yeah.
And we need to teach them how to be civilized.
Amen. Let's do it.
Okay.
Okay.
That's the end of part 1.
Stay tuned next week for part 2.
Bye, friends.
Bye.